out how to do this. Yeah, you'd think I'd know how to do it by now. But welcome to the Whisky Circus again, everybody. I would play some intro music, but I can't be bothered today. We've got two fantastic guests on today. Gordon Dundas from Ian MacLeod Distillers. Going to be talking about Glengoyne, Tamdhu, and possibly a little bit about Rosebank.
Could well do, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and then we've got Erik Burgess. I hope I've pronounced that right.
Yes.
Yep. Going to tell us everything about the sherry side of things and hopefully how it links into the whiskey side. And between Gordon and Erik, we've obviously got a lot of sherry-dominated whiskies and things like that. So I think it's a perfect way of bringing it in. So what I'm going to do now is hand over to Gordon first, and hopefully he'll give us a little bit of intro into his job, his day-to-day life, and the whiskies that he represents. So over to you, Gordon.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. I hope you're all well. And great to be here on a Sunday afternoon. And a little dram just to go along with, just a nice little 10-year-old, Glengoyne 10-year-old, just to beautiful whiskey for the time of day. So yeah, my role at Ian MacLeod is, I mean, I'll say a little bit about my history. I've been in whiskey for 2003, so I've been in whiskey for 17 odd years now, frighteningly. And so I initially worked for Whiskey Magazine in a commercial role. I wasn't a writer. A lot of people think I was a writer. I wasn't a writer. And was in charge of their sort of developing their Whiskey Live brand into different markets, so whiskey shows into the States and other things. And what that allowed me to do was to get an amazing understanding and meet some wonderful people in the whiskey industry. But I also realized quite quickly that shows and magazines and that sort of thing, you know, well, not quick enough probably, but wasn't for me. So I actually joined Morrison Bowmore Distillers before it became Beam Suntory in 2011. And I worked on Bowmore, Auchitosh and Glengarry until, well, really it then turned into Beam Suntory in 2014 when I was living out in Taiwan at that point, representing the brands in Asia. I came back, I worked in travel retail for a couple of years for Beam Suntory, in charge of their whole of their portfolio in travel retail, which was, you know, every brand had unique whiskey. So that was quite an interesting development. And then I moved from Beam Suntory to Ian MacLeod. The opportunity to work for a family business was a really big draw for me, as was Glengoyne, which was always been my local distillery, the first distillery I visited. And right up there with Bowmore as my two favorite whiskies. So, you know, not a bad thing. And then obviously the Rosebank feature, knowing that Rosebank was coming down the pipe was quite an interesting sort of add-on for me. So, you know, that's been my sort of whiskey journey of 17 years, and it's been eventful. There's been some magical moments in it, and it's been a really good fun. It's a wonderful industry to work in because, as you guys all probably know, it's got great people in it, and that's what makes it such a great industry. Is we work fairly collaboratively. We work, you know, everybody's respectful of each other. There's a lot of, you forget all the other elements of the whiskey that moves around in the background in the marketplace. So, you know, we all need each other as well. And so, so, you know, I'm loving working for Ian MacLeod, family business, you know, agile, you know, interesting, doing some really good things. And just as a sort of side note, we actually own Edinburgh Gin as well. So it's a big, we're a pretty big business, but we're not massive. We're not, you know, we're not a huge business, but we're a fairly big business. So it's pleasure to be here. So so I hand over to Erik, and then we'll get going.
Yeah, what we can do now is, so we've obviously got Erik as well. So Erik, if you could give us a sort of brief introduction to yourself and what you do, because you're obviously a lot different to our normal guests, and I think this ties perfectly into the conversation today, and really pleased to have you on as well.
Great. No, thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to this. Sort of whiskey is part of my life, but as well, my wife and I became members of Glasgow's Whisky Club 15 years ago, roughly. and our first outing as a married couple was to Auchentoshan. I've worked in the licence trade for 30 years. I was a committee member of Glasgow's Whisky Club for 8 years, and I've met Gordon he's done a couple of tastings that Laura and my wife and I have attended. But one of the things during my whisky journey was you got a whisky and it said it's sherry cask matured. And we basically had the opportunity during International Sherry Week in June 2014 to take part in a tweet tasting that was organised by a guy called Ruben Whiten from sherrynotes.com. He also wrote a blog called sherrynotes.be, I think it's called. And we basically were given samples of Fino, Amontillado, Oloroso, Palicattado, and PX to try. And basically we booked a holiday down to Lucia later that week. So we went to Granada, Montilla, Cordoba, Jerez, and El Puerto de Santa Maria for 6 nights in September 2014. We basically got hooked on the people and the wines. We've both been back to Montilla-Moriles, which is in Cordoba province, which is it's the same. And to give you an idea, sherry is in the southwest corner of Andalusia, and you've got 3 other main DOs. You've got Condado de Huelva, which is west of sherry, Montilla northeast, and you've got Malaga and Sierra de Malaga. So there's 4 DOs, but there's other winemaking regions in Andalusia. So we basically, in September 2016, we became the first people from the UK to be qualified as technical specialists in the generous wines and vinegars of Montilla-Moriles. And Montilla-Moriles is basically, they make wines in the same way as sherry in terms of they've got the Solera system as well. And those of you who are not sure about this, we can explain the Solera system in more detail later. And then in September 2018, I became a certified sherry educator. And there's only, I think, looking at the website, I think there's about 45 in the UK, and about 350 worldwide. And at the moment, I work in a 5-star hotel in Glasgow, and I do wine training, and part of that involves sherry and wines from Andalusia and that. So basically, it's a passion. We've been to the region. This will be the first year since 2014 we've not been to Spain, which is quite strange.
Yeah, it is strange times at the moment, but what I'll actually do is I will just swap it round a little bit, if Gordon's all right with that, and we'll sort of stay with you for a minute, Erik. If you could give us a kind of brief intro into the way sherry is made and things like that, and then we can go to Gordon to actually discuss the whiskey side, and then we'll kind of flip between you both then.
Yep. Okay. Yeah. So basically, sherry is made from 3 different grapes: Palomino Fino, Moscatel, and Pedro Jimenez. But the main variety, the most is made from Palomino Fino. So you get Fino, Amontillados, Palicattados, and Olorosos. So basically, the Palomino Fino, when it's harvested, is maybe 12 to 13% ABV at the most on the vine. What happens is they'll harvest it, and they'll classify the juice that comes from the grapes as either first must or second must. And the first must will be used to make finos, which will then become finos and manzanillas actually as well, and amontillados. And then the second must will be fortified once fermentation is complete to 17%. It goes straight into being made into Oloroso. So finos and manzanillas start their life. The must will be maybe 12, 13%. It gets fortified with neutral grape spirit up to 15%, and it gets put into the Solera and Criadera system, which was basically, it's basically, Solera is the cask which is closest to the ground because it's related to the Spanish word suelo. The layers above that is the first Criadera, and above that then you have maybe a second and third Criadera. Some bodegas will have as many as 10 Criaderas. And the more Criaderas you have, the older the average age of the wine is. So sherry, basically about 98% of sherry it'll be an average age wine. You have single vintage sherries, but they're only about 2% of the overall production of sherry. So what happens is you can take up to one third of the volume of the sherry from the Solera cask at the bottom and bottle it. And then what happens, the the third that's taken out of the Solera cask gets replaced by wine from the first Criadera system. So basically, you're refreshing each level from the first Criadera refreshes the Solera, the second Criadera refreshes the first Criadera, and so on and so on. And so basically, the wines that would have been harvested in Jerez last year will be going into the top Criadera in the Solera system this year. They're basically, it can be anywhere between 3 to 9 months before they actually go into the Solera system.
Yeah.
So you've got the two types as well. I haven't explained. There's two types of aging in sherry. You've got biological age sherries, which are basically Fino and Manzanilla, and oxidative age sherries, which would be PXs, Moscatel, and Oloroso. So what happens is the casks in the Solera system are never full. They're only 5/5 full. So basically, there's a small gap, maybe about 6 inches at the top of the cask. And what happens in the biologically aged sherries of Fino and Manzanilla, a layer of floor forms on top of the wine, and basically you have no oxygen affecting the wine. So basically, that's the biologically aged wine. So you've got the 3 sherry towns. You've got El Puerto de Santa Maria, Jerez de la Frontera, and San Lucar de Barrameda. Manzanilla can only come from San Lucar de Barrameda. It's actually got its own DO. It's Manzanilla de San Lucar de Barrameda. And so what happens is, to get an Amontillado, any Amontillado will start off as a Fino or a Manzanilla. There's 2 ways of an Amontillado starting. You can fortify the wine to 17% with neutral grape spirit, which kills the yeast. And basically what happens is, once the yeast is killed, the oxygen starts affecting the wine, and that's why an Oloroso and a Amontillado and a Palo sherry are basically a lot darker in color than a Fino and Manzanillas and Finos basically are very, very pale in color.
Quite different flavors. Your Finos are quite dry, aren't they?
Finos and Manzanillas are among the driest wines in the world. You're probably less than 2 grams per liter of sugar. And then you've got sherries, Pedro Jimenez sherries, some in Montilla-Moriles, you can get over 400 grams per liter of sugar.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing that and I'm taking on board all of that, I mean, that's fantastic, is the one thing that I learned. I went to Jerez about 2 years ago with Tamdhu, and we did some great catching up on it and some videos and things, which I'll send the links to, people can have a look at. But one of the things which struck me about it, which I think not so many people know this, is that these old Solera casks are quite interesting things. I mean, they have been around, they've been in these Soleras for, can be 60, 70, 80 years. Can they not, sort of, Erik? That sort of age?
Well, some of them are actually, some of them are up to nearly 200 years old.
Yeah, there you go, yeah. And the key thing is that, as Erik says, that there's still people out there who think sherry casks from a whiskey perspective come from these. So that is not the case.
No. Yeah.
They do not come from those Solera casks because they're impossible to get. Some people have got them in the past and finished in them. But the key point is, and this is the point that I was really aware of when I went there, exactly what Erik said, oxidative and biological aging, not interactive. These casks are pretty dead. They are basically vessels to allow sherry to mature in the 2 ways that Erik's so they're useless really for color and flavor from a whiskey perspective.
I mean, that was one thing. Sorry, that was one thing I was going to ask Erik, because obviously I was under the impression that the casks used in sherry are basically not very active. So do you then take casks that have been used, or have you seasoned them before you've brought them in, or how do you get them to be inactive, or do you just not char them?
Well, what happens basically? The article, I'll send you the link to the article that Ruben. It's fantastic. I've taken some key points out of it, but basically, the majority of sherry casks used in the whiskey industry never see a Solera. They're basically just virgin oak, charred to the specification of the distillery. The size of the cask is specified by the distillery. What the charring level will be and what wines they want, whether they want to put a Amontillado in it, PX, Oloroso, how long do they want to season the cask for. Basically, the seasoning of the cask, it takes the tannins out of the wood.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the sherry that's used to season cask is not for drinking when it's been after it's been seasoned. It's not the same
No.
quality that would go into a Solera system.
No.
And it may get used up to 4 times, but generally maybe once or twice at most. And once it's been, the casks have been seasoned. Generally, what you find with a virgin oak cask, they might season it for 6 months and then replace the liquid, because obviously you do get evaporation. And some, I know Amaret in India, for instance, they'll season casks for up to 3 years.
Yeah. No, everybody's a little bit different, and I'll obviously go through what we do from a Glengoyne Tamdhu perspective. But it's absolutely right, and so I think Erik can talk brilliantly about when I went there. I'm like, I went to Bodega Baron, I went to Williams and Humbert, we went to another bodega, and you're drinking this wonderful sherry out of straight from the bottom rack, the Solera. The whole, you drink it, you go, why are people not drinking this stuff? It's fantastic, genuinely gorgeous stuff. And I went home a complete sherry fan. But let me say now, that is that. Sherry and whiskey casks is this. And that's the point. There's really not a lot of connection between the two.
No, but that was the whole point of kind of getting you two together, because I mean, I do know of the odd distillery that have managed to get these Solera casks, and like Erik has just said, they're 70 years old before they even start. And to me, that means they're probably going to get 1, maybe 2 fills of sherry for a maturation, and then they're done. They're not going to have anything left, because you're basically only extracting the sherry from the cask. It's got no wood influence at that age.
And they're all American oak, just to let you know as well. They're not European oak, they're all American oak. So
maybe with the exception of Macallan. Macallan have their own forests up in Galicia in the north of Spain, and have Spanish oak.
I was meaning from a Solera perspective.
That's the other thing. Is like you have this romantic notion of Spanish sherry oak casks and Soleras, and it's not. You ask the bodega, what's the wood? Because basically, American oak, basically the grains are finer. The less porous than European oak. So there's less interaction with air getting into the casks as well. I think one of the things when I was researching for today was basically what happened was the UK has been a big market for sherry for centuries, and what the sherry casks that people like to romanticize about were actually what we called back in the day transport casks. And they actually weren't even they were actually thicker staves. They were bigger. I think it was 700 litres possibly. I think a sherry butt's 600, I think. Is that right?
500, yeah.
500, right. So up until 1986, when basically these casks, the sherry got shipped in bulk to the UK, got sold in shops and restaurants and off sales, and the casks were never sent back to Spain for reuse. They were just sold under distilleries. Yeah. And obviously in 1986, the Spanish government brought in a law which basically meant that all sherries had to be exported in bottles. And so these casks became as rare as hen's teeth. The market changed, and hence seasoning of casks is actually a Cooper in Andalucía and Jerez or Montilla-Moriles will probably make more deal with casks for seasoning whiskey than they would for casks for a bodega in Andalucía.
I think what was really, from my perspective, when I went there, and you go to Williams and Humbert, which is the only way to describe when you go into this building, it is designed in such a way that it's perfect for the sort of storage of sherry casks and sherry, and it's got this arch. It's like a cathedral. I mean, it's genuinely like a cathedral. And you go in there, and you see. We went with the master. I can't remember the word. It's not distiller, but master maker of sherry, whatever the word is.
The oenologist.
Yeah, that's the one.
The winemaker.
She was the winemaker, master winemaker.
Paula Medina, I think her name was.
Yeah, fantastically interesting, and she took us to one of their old Soleras, and we were asking her all the questions, and we were filming everything for Tamdhu, and it was great. And then you sort of walk just down around the sort of corner a wee bit further, and then you just suddenly realise you're seeing lines of whiskey cask seasoning, lines of just, our ones as well. So there's, lines and lines. And so maybe, I don't know, half the warehouse, don't know, is got seasoning whiskey casks in it. And it just makes you realize how important that the industry of manufacturing and seasoning casks and the production of the sherry to go in them is really important to that region now.
Yeah, I think the other thing to going back to the 1980s and what have you, a lot of people use the name sherry cask, or put sherry casks on their malt whiskies, and I know for a fact that, you know, a lot of the casks that came to Scotland were never in the sherry triangle to start with. An Oloroso seasoned cask from Montilla and an Oloroso seasoned cask from Jerez is going to give the same characteristics to the whiskey. You know, there's very little difference in terms of when you're talking about a seasoned whiskey cask. Now, one of the guys we met on our first day in Andalusia back in September 2014, a guy called Rafa Cabello, he's got a tonelera in Montilla. He supplies 32 different whiskey distilleries worldwide.
Yeah.
And casks. You know, that's how big an industry it is.
Yeah, no, it's huge. And I mean, just to give you a little bit of context for us, I'm just going to answer this question from Dram Gazette. Is the sherry used and sold after seasoning? The sherry that's used for seasoning will genuinely, as Erik sort of intimated, could be reblended and used again, if depending on how spicy it is, because it will take on an element of the spiciness from the oak, particularly European oak. It can be reblended, and it can be various ages. We specify what we want. That's an average age, though, not Scotch whisky age. The other thing is sometimes, and Erik will know, it goes to make cheaper brandy or vinegar as well.
Basically, it would never go into a Solera system. It would be used to make sherry brandy, or distilled to make brandy or make vinegar. And that's the other thing as well, as, you know, vinegar is something that's, I don't know whether you had a chance to try any vinegars when you were there. Sherry vinegar is an amazing product.
It is. Yeah, it is. Yeah, no, really, really interesting. So it'll be used again for more seasoning, potentially. Depends on what, it might be blended with some other stuff, other Oloroso, or but it won't be bottled. It won't be bottled.
It'd never be bottled, and it wouldn't go into a Solera.
But we tried some. So we season our casks for about 2 years plus. So that's pretty long. And I'm just going to tell you a little bit about why we got into where we are. Is we bought Glengoyne in 2003 from Edrington, Macallan. We bought Tamdhu in 2011 from Edrington, Macallan. So both these distilleries have huge sherry credentials and stocks, and have used the same, effectively, sherry casks that Macallan have used and built their brand on, if we're honest. So we were never like all good things in whiskey. We were never going to change that. So we were driven by using the same quality producers in Spain. So we work with 3 toneleras, 3 cooperages, who effectively get our oak from America as well as from northern Spain. So we do still get oak from northern Spain, and they go through the same process. These 2 oaks go through the same, firstly, air drying process. So the one thing that we do is we air dry our oak. Now, that's a really, really big difference between kiln drying it, which would be quicker and financially better. I'm just going to go through the process. I think it makes sense. It's maybe about the right time.
It's important.
We air dry the oak. It's really, really important. We need the rain. We need the Spanish heat, which starts off in northern Spain, in Lugo, where we cut down the Spanish oak. The American oak's imported into there as well as logs, generally, can be staged. They will go through the same air drying process. So you have these 2 oaks going through the same process. They then come down to Jerez. They're air dried again, much hotter down there, of course. So for about 2 years, quite a lot of different elements. And then they go into these cooperages. We work with Huberto de Mec, we work with Tavassa, we work with Vicima. They're 3 great cooperages, family run, and they then form our casks. So Vicima tend to do more American oak, Tavassa tend to do more European oak, and Humberto de Mec do a little bit of both. And they will go into there, and there's some wonderful photos and things, and I'll share you a link to a video that you should watch, because it's a really good video in terms of the process. They get toasted, they get formed into a cask, they get toasted, very different to bourbon charring. Hugely different. Bourbon charring, 1 minute maximum, very, very, very gas-fired high temperature. Generally toasting in Spain, it's a fire pit, so probably 200 degrees. Toasting lasts for 30 to 40 minutes. General rule, toast a bit longer, you might get more color in your whiskey. And then after that, it's hooked up, totally made up, pressure tested, and then it goes and gets its Oloroso and sits in a warehouse for 2+ years. And then it will eventually come to Glengoyne and Tamdhu, 100% whole cask. It will not be broken down into states. So
I think
that is our, and this video that I will share on the chat, and I'll share it with everybody, please watch it. It's, I don't know if Erik, if you've seen it, but it's a very honest, very honest saying of this is how we make our sherry casks.
Yeah.
I think the interesting thing to pick up out of that, Gordon, is the fact of how long it actually takes from cutting down the tree to it being a cask. You know,
I mean, it's unbelievable. I went and cut that, not me personally with a chainsaw, but I watched an I would have got it going the wrong way and landed it on the Land Rover or something. I watched a professional chainsaw tree cutter downer, whatever the word is. What's it called? Lumberjack.
A lumberjack.
A tree cutter downer. Yeah, a lumberjack. I've not even had that much whiskey.
I'm going to say, you did say the 10-year-old, didn't you?
Yeah, I'm on the 10-year-old. Brilliant whiskey for a hot summer's day.
I'm on a Rebajito, which is Fino and Sprite with some mint and lime.
Lovely, lovely. I might have a wee highball next. But anyway, cut down this tree, and you know, just these are the sort of things that I'm just going to go through a couple more points, and then we'll be cut down this tree, and this tree falls down. And I got a little bit emotional. I actually got, it's a 100-year-old tree, and you're like, I actually got a little, and it, funnily enough, it starts weeping because the water's so full of water, and you're like, oh, got a little bit teary. I was like, that's a real, makes you just sort of, you just stand back a little bit. And I actually put it on Instagram and said, oh, look, there's a guy I know who really likes whiskey just wrote, bastards. And I was like, hey, if you like whiskey, we need to do this. But the key point is here is actually people think it's the sherry that makes sherry casks expensive. Well, it's the process. I've just talked you through it, but it's actually availability of wood is a real issue because you can only cut down so much European oak, and American oak's prices are going up as well. However, so we cut this tree down, and it's a big, massive tree. And I was like, wow, that's amazing. I said to the sort of Narciso, who's from our cooperage, I said, Narciso, how many casks would you get from that tree? I was expecting to say 3, 4, 5, 1, maybe 1.5, because the bit you need is the straight bit. You need the straight bit to get either a hogshead size, a puncheon, or a butt. And so it's the tree that determines what you can make from it, if you know what I mean. So that's the key point. So none of the wood goes to waste. It all goes to be used for other things. It's not thrown away, but from a cask perspective, you need straight staves, and that's the key point. So he said, you might get 1.5 from this one. And I was like, really? But I mean, it's just, so that shows you it's the availability of the oak is the really expensive part, because it's all protected. You can only cut down 5% of the forests, and you've got to allow it to naturally regenerate and all this sort of thing, which absolutely is correct, which is why they're over. Add into that then the process that it all goes through that I've just told you, which is 5 to 6 years. And you suddenly understand that, you know, these casks cost £1,000 plus each, and that's the point, and that's why we invest so heavily in sherry casks, because, and all the things that make them different, because, you know, even if you wanted to, you do the whole process, and then if you break them down and put them on a pallet, you're sort of going, why have we just gone through all that if we've broken down the integrity of the cask to transport more? So all these things come together, and it really means that when you drink from our perspective, you drink a Glengoyne or a Tamdhu, I think you taste the quality. I genuinely really do think you taste the quality. And we don't
the thing that obviously comes out of that is then that if we all go on about that not many people are drinking sherry, the fact is it wouldn't really make that much of a difference if more people drink sherry, because the sherry casks are separate anyway. Yeah.
It's different sherry. And so when people say to me, oh, we need to drink more sherry, I'm like, no, you don't really, but you should, because it's great. But you should, because it's fantastic. But no, because it's ultimately, it's actually capacity. Capacity is another problem. All these Tonelleras are pretty much, well, the ones we work with can't, but you know, if you phone up our Tavassa Cooperage and go, can I have 150 sherry casks in 6 months' time? He would laugh at you because he can't make any more than he can do at the moment.
Yeah.
So there's an element of that. So, and obviously, you know, all of our sherry is from Jerez, from within the Sherry Triangle. We are Oloroso officially approved, and that makes us, as exactly as Eric said earlier, there are some whiskies out there that maybe say they're sherry but aren't officially sherry.
Which kind of brings us nicely onto the fact of now you, between you both, have killed the romanticism of having all these old sherry casks maturing our whiskey. And in reality, they're all pretty much brand new casks that have held a little bit of sherry. We'll now come over to you, Gordon, actually talk about the fact that, you know, the majority of the sherries, the whiskies that are made by Tamdhu and Glengoyne is virtually all sherry casks. So, you know, would you like to now talk a little bit about the two distilleries and sort of lead?
Yeah, look, more than happy to do that. And certainly from, like, you know, that whole story that I just told you, those sherry casks come and go to both distilleries.
Yeah.
So, you know, we're using sherry casks across both, and that story of American and European oak shows you a really big difference. I'm going to go and get 2 bottles of whiskey that I want to show you something.
Yeah,
Give me
no problem.
2 seconds.
While Gordon's, sorry, Soren, while Gordon's, we've had a question from Edward about Patharetti, which was basically a process they used to use where they would have PX and they would have a Aropi, which is basically PX is like reduced down to a syrup, and they would put it into casks and pressurize the cask so that the actual, this Patharetti would go up to 1 inch into the staves. And basically, Gordon, I think, has been asked to say what was banned for use in sauce, but like checking with Ruben, it was never actually banned. The actual, the process of this with the wood, it didn't do much to the whiskey.
Yeah, that's where I was actually going to ask you to go, actually. So you interrupted perfectly.
Yeah.
But no, I mean,
the industry basically just thought it didn't really, wasn't benefiting at all.
No. It did nothing to the whiskey.
No, absolutely. So the only reason I've got 2 whiskies here that are totally, and this is the point, and now you probably struggle to see the color difference.
Yeah.
But you probably, let me get a bit of white paper might help.
Yeah.
Yep.
That makes sense. So if you look at the whiskey as you look at it, this one,
yeah,
that's a teapot dram, okay? That's an average age of about 10, okay? This one is 17-year-old single cask, okay? This is American oak Oloroso sherry casks. So this one, the 17-year-old, is American oak Oloroso sherry. The younger one by nearly half, but not quite, is European oak. So you can see that the younger whiskey is darker because of the fact that we've used European oak ahead of American oak. So that whole, as you probably all well know, that whole color, if you took the labels off this and asked which was oldest, most people would go for this one because but that we know that's not the case. But what this emphasizes is that an American oak sherry cask that goes through the same process as a European oak sherry cask from our perspective produced 2 hugely different styles of whiskey.
And is that, Gordon, because the European oak soaks up more of that sherry because it's got a coarser grain?
Not just that, but yes, there's a lot of reasons. American oak, as Eric mentioned, is tighter. As Soren mentioned, it's tighter. So when you toast it, you don't toast it as deep. It doesn't quite open up as much. So there is that. It's also a very different type of oak. It's got more vanillin, less tannins, all these types of things. So that's when you know, most people think American oak, think bourbon casks or hogsheads. But actually, you know, in a sherry cask, you get an element of that vanilla still because it's American oak. You get an element of lighter sort of stewed fruits, and you get this sweetness a little bit further forward in the palate. European oak completely different style of oak, much more tannins, and it does open out more when you toast it because it is a looser grain, Quercus robur. It does suck up sherry, of course, and there's of course an element of that. But the key point, and I will always say, this proves that the color is all about the oak. It's all about the oak. It's about, you know, how the oak delivers over time the different colors and flavors. There is of course a bit of sherry in the oak. We know that, but the sherry is actually put in there to do a job on the oak, because it comes out two years later very spicy. The sherry will come out very spicy out of a European oak cask, less spicy out of an American oak cask, and it's taken some of those big bold tannins and things that we wouldn't want in our whiskey, that we really don't want in our whiskey. And that's also just the final point, is that's also very different when you char a cask very, very high temperatures in bourbon land. You don't get into the oak as much, if you know what I mean. So you're not getting some of those other things. So it's a fundamental point to understand that these two oaks deliver two, not distinctly different, but very different styles of maturation, which we combine pretty much most of the time at Tamdhu, and pretty much in most of our core range up to the 18-year-old at Glengoyne. So they deliver very different flavors.
I mean, one thing with that, Gordon, I don't know whether you would have been involved with this one, but I've got one of the Scottish wood Glengoynes.
Oh, right.
And I don't know whether you could
Spicy.
sort of tell us much how the Scottish oak interacts.
I once asked Robbie Hughes about this. If you actually watch the, we did a Facebook Live about a week and a bit ago. And we were talking about innovation and things, and Robbie was in his office. Yeah, Robbie's from Newcastle. I mean, hilarious gentleman. Every time I see him, he's just talking, you know, utter bollocks, which is great. But he's basically said, and he was asked about innovation, and he said, "Oh, I could go and get some stuff over here." And he brought down a Scottish oak, and he brought down one or two things, and he says, most of this is crap, you see, because it just doesn't work, he says. Most of it just doesn't stand up to the quality, we won't use it. Now, the Scottish oak, I think, was actually pretty good, but the one thing a lot of people said, it was quite spicy.
It's very spicy, yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, I don't know the ins and outs of Scottish oak compared to European oak, but I think it delivers quite a spicy...
I just wondered whether it was the bitterness of the Scottish towards the English.
I hope not. I hope that's not the case.
You know, it was just, that might go south of the border. Let's make it a little bit bitter for them.
I hope not. But I mean,
joking, obviously.
Even our 10-year-old, it has got American and European oak first fill, 30% first fill sherry casks.
Yeah.
Now, there's not many 10-year-olds or whiskies at that sort of price point that you could say there's 30% first fill sherry casks. So
no. Well, that's it. And I mean, your Glengoyne 10-year-old was actually, I've still got the bottle down here, was the very first bottle I bought from a distillery itself. That's going back some years now. So it always holds quite a sweet spot for me. And so that's what I'm drinking now, is the 10-year-old. But what the sort of interest to me is the fact of both the distilleries are predominantly sherry orientated. And, you know, is that something that we'll see continuing going forward, or will we see a little bit more bourbon coming into it?
Well, Glengoyne and bourbon is the first thing about Glengoyne is you know, it never peated, so we actually focus on a very fruity spirit. I'm not here to talk about the ins and outs of distillation, but if I took you to 10 different whiskey distilleries, we all use the same barley pretty much. Forget the peated ones just for the sake of this question. We all use the same barley. We all pretty much use the same yeast. Water's a little bit different in Scotland, but you know, so the idiosyncrasies of each distillery are the main idiosyncrasy. The main thing that you would look at is the shape of the stills to help you determine obviously what style of spirit you may get. What people don't talk about is temperatures, and how you heat those stills is really, really important, because you know, it's a bit like if you're trying to make soup and you let it boil, it doesn't taste as good. It's a real simmer thing, soup. You can't really let soup boil, apparently. I don't cook soup, but apparently.
No, yeah.
My mum told me that when I was very young. Anyway, So when we actually heat our stills, we do it in a way that we get up to the boiling point of alcohol, which is anybody. What is the boiling point of alcohol?
78.
Nice. 0.3, I think. But yes.
Yeah.
So we get up to that and we literally hold it. We actually literally hold it very close to that temperature, which effectively more reflux, less of the heavy vapors going over the top. But it's all about fruitiness for us. We've got 2 spirit stills as well. So we split it into 2 spirit stills to increase that as well. So Tamdhu, different Tamdhus, but same principle, not overly heated, but much squatter stills. It's a more oily spirit. But the sherry casks go to both. And so I've completely forgotten what I was talking about.
So about the bourbon coming into it. Or
Oh, that's right. Yeah. So the fruity, the fruity spirit,
Not live.
the fruity spirit really lends itself to sherry cask as well as bourbon. So I think we'll see a couple of more influenced bourbon releases because I think Glengoyne is so wonderful in bourbon. Tamdhu, 100% Oloroso sherry casks. Every time you pick up this kind of bottle, it will be 100% Oloroso sherry casks, seasoned, what I've just told you, 6 years, from start to finish, first fill, refill. So we have 4 components: American oak first fill, European oak first fill, and refills all together in our 12, 15, and batch strength. So that's how, but in our 12-year-old, for example, at Glengoyne has a little bit of first fill bourbon. Yeah. Sometimes our cask strengths have a tiny percentage of first fill bourbon, but I think we will maybe see a bit more coming in because it's so good.
Well, that's it. I mean, you certainly see quite a bit of the Glengoyne bourbon style released by independent bottlers.
Yeah.
You know, and so I mean, I know how good it can be as
beautiful. Yeah.
In that size. So you know, you obviously do kind of wonder why the distillery doesn't really look at it in the sense of releasing a bourbon matured whiskey rather than a little bit of both, but you know, it's understandable as to why they don't as well.
Yeah, no, look, we like to stay true to what we are. Glengoyne's always been sherry, always have had a lot of sherry in it. We are a business which, you know, when we bought Glengoyne, it's a great story. Leonard, who, if you've ever met Leonard, you should read his interview that was on scotchwhiskey.com. Absolutely hilarious. Anyway, I think it's still up on the internet. I was speaking to somebody about that website. It was a real demise, that website. It was a good website.
Yeah, it was a shame.
It was a shame. Anyway, so when he bought Glengoyne, he was he'd taken Edrington, the board of Edrington out for lunch at a race course on a Saturday. I think they were still at the table at 8 o'clock in the evening. That's a proper lunch. And I think he'd managed to sort of do the deal. And, 4 or 5 days later, he's sitting outside Glengoyne distillery waiting for the money to go through. Money went through. He walks in and everybody was a bit nervous, was a little bit like, oh, what's happening? What's going on? He basically turned around and said, I have absolutely no idea how to make Glengoyne. You all do. Please continue on. And there's people still working there from that day. So that sort of just tells you a little bit about how we run our business. And that's really, really, that all goes through everything to the whiskey. And when we bought Tamdhu, we bought Tamdhu for 2 reasons. We didn't buy Tamdhu to ultimately create this whiskey, but of course we wanted to. We bought it to give us volume because we use so much whiskey in other parts of our business. We produce a blend, for example, that sells 800,000 cases around the world. So, we do have a lot of other requirements, and Glengoyne is not the biggest distillery in the world. So Tamdhu was bought for volume. But when we looked at all the stock for single, it was all sherry. So Leonard basically just said at that point, I want to make a sherry cask only single malt Speyside. And that immediately takes the whole of the Scotch whiskey landscape in terms of taste down to about that.
Yeah.
Because there's no other people that really do it 100%. I mean, we know that Glendronach are great sherry experts, and we know that Glenfarclas and Aberlour and Macallan, but they've moved away from it, obviously. So there's a huge sort of, and Tamdhu is beginning to create a little bit of momentum with its sherry credentials, which is great.
And I mean, one thing that I like about both distilleries is they obviously still celebrate the history. And you've obviously, one of the bottles that you've kind of shown already, the teapot dram. And then we go to Tamdhu with I always kill the name of it, so I'll let you pronounce it. But the one that's named after the train station.
Dalby Alley.
Dalby Alley, that's the one. I always think of Harry Potter with that one and Diagon Alley. So, but could you tell us a little bit about both those stories? I know everybody's kind of heard them, but I still think they're interesting enough to talk about them a little bit more as well.
Well, the Teapot Dram is a great story. It's about, unbelievably, and you look back on it now and you go, really? People, as part of their deal for working in a distillery, either got new make 2 or 3 times a day in a glass. Here, drink this, and then go and operate some heavy machinery. Or in Glengoyne's actual, they got young whiskey. They got whiskey that was young and strong, and Duncan McNichol, who this 17-year-old, which was bottled by him, selected by him. Duncan McNichol retired in January, been at 43 years in the industry, and he was the young guy back then in the sort of 70s, early 70s, and he was like, I'm not drinking all this. And so at Glengoyne, there was a canteen, there was a sort of area where everybody, and there was this teapot. And so he was advised that, well, if you're not going to drink it, you should pop it in the teapot so people can have some tea later. And so some of the younger guys popped their sort of daily drams, or they weren't even drams. I mean, it was this sort of much. It was ridiculous. Into the teapot. And then before the night shift on a Friday or after a night shift, everybody's, let's have some tea, you know, the tea would get poured round for everybody. And so that's where the Teapot Dram story comes from. And so, you know, the whiskies were in batch number 7 now, but I mean, it's about, it's a young first fill sherry cask whiskey. This is the oldest one that we've ever used. We've used 13 and 14 years old in here, but it's a young first fill only, sherry cask, European oak only. So it's a great dram, but it celebrates that wonderful story. And the Dalby Alley dram, from the Tamdhu perspective, is all about, you know, if we don't have a visitor centre at Tamdhu, you can't visit Tamdhu. We'd rather spend the money on casks because we'd have to spend quite a lot of money to get it up to speed for visitors. And you know, it's just not, the brand is not there yet. It's very much, it's still a brand that people are still discovering who are whiskey people, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
And we'd rather focus on the liquid. And I think that's exactly the correct decision from our perspective. Rather than, you know, having loads, well, at the moment, we wouldn't rush to be doing a visitor centre, but you know what I mean? It's you know, there's some great brands, established brands up there who do a great visitor experience. We're not wanting to go up against them. Let's talk about our whiskey. So, if you go to Tamdhu, the one thing, I mean, the location is stunning. It's genuinely Speyside. You're a stone's throw from the Spey. You can see it. The station is why it was built there. It was the access. We've got records of sherry cask coming in and going out in 1897. So, it's why the distillery was made there. It was built there, and so it's a wonderful location. But the distillery itself is not what you would call particularly beautiful, but the location is stunning, and it makes fantastic whiskey. Slightly heavier, oilier spirit, very, 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 very lightly peated malt as well, but you don't pick it up in the whiskey.
Yeah,
I certainly don't. So so the Dalby Alley dram, which is released at the Spirit of Speyside Whiskey Festival, which obviously was cancelled this year, is effectively, I guess, if you want Tamdhu's version of the teapot. Sorry, what was that?
Sorry. Carry on, Gordon. I'm sorry. I've got my assistant Laura getting me some props.
All right. Sorry. I'm about to shut up now, and I'll answer some questions. Is effectively our celebrate. I mean, the last one was 62% alcohol, so these are high strength. So obviously filled at much stronger than 63.5. I mean, you know, a lot of these whiskies casks would have been filled at 69. And so if you think of the batch strength series that we do, the Dalby, the batch strength is effectively, we add a little bit of water to bring it down to a more accessible cask strength, sort of 58% level. So it's not cask strength, the batch strength there. We've added a smidgen of water. But the Dalby Alley's up at 62%, and this teapot just is at 59.9. So these are big whiskies.
I mean, one of the questions that have come in, and this is probably a little bit for Eric, but obviously you'll know the answers as well. The cask that were always used for the transporting, does that still kind of go ahead? Is it still used that way? I know you've sort of answered the fact of those casks wouldn't have been the Solera casks, but obviously the sale of the Soleras and the transport casks, is it still ongoing, or are they just all season now?
No, basically sherry can only be exported in bottles. So basically right. you won't get sherry sent to, and even in like plastic containers. It's basically other regions in Andalusia will do bag and box, but certainly these casks, they stopped using them in 1986. The Spanish government brought in a law that basically sherry had to be exported in bottles only, and therefore these casks are obsolete. There may be some distilleries that have some of these casks somewhere in the deepest, darkest depths of their warehouses, but not at the, it's a practice that, finished in 1986.
Yeah.
I mean, there's no guarantee that you're going to get great whiskey,
No.
And that's the key point. And, I think Dalmore has used them. We've used them in the past. We did a series that was finished in Palo Cortado casks, I think. I mean, I don't think it set the world on fire, if I'm honest. I think it was sold one bottle of our whiskey with a bottle of the sherry. Great story, but it was way before my time. But I mean, I think it was used for a particular market. But I think from a maturation perspective, it's a really, really difficult thing to use, because you're not going to get a lot of, you might get a hint of the sherry, of course, but you're not going to get anything else from it. So finishing is the obvious thing to do.
Yeah, I mean, that's it. You kind of look at the romanticism of using these really old casks that have been stored in the bodegas for however long, but like we said earlier, this in theory just doesn't happen anymore. So we are looking at casks that have been seasoned 2, 3, 4 years. But do you think there is a level sort of where you go beyond with the seasoning? Is 2 years to 3 years a perfect age, or would it be 5, 6 years could be better, or would you get to a point where it just stops working, sort of thing?
It's getting the balance right between what the sherry takes away from the oak and what it leaves.
Yeah,
that's the point. Yeah. You want it to leave obviously something.
Yeah.
Depends what you're trying to create. You can use older sherry sometimes, which has a different effect on the oak. You can use younger sherry. But we generally season somewhere between about
20. How many casks?
We season for about 20 months, 20 to 24, 26 months, which is one of the longest in the industry. Even simple things like when we season, all our casks sit on their side. They're not in pallets, where a lot of people put them on pallets. They sit on their side. So it actually looks, when you take a photo of a row of our casks for Ian MacLeod Distillers, it doesn't help with that image for a lot of people that it's a Solera. It's not a Solera, it's just how it looks, okay? It's just our casks seasoning with that sherry.
Yeah.
You just mentioned that. Oh, sorry, if I could just interject while we're on it. You mentioned, Gordon, about sort of you want the sherry to leave something behind. So if you had one of these old sort of bodega casks, which are going to be absolutely knackered. Could you kind of describe maybe the sort of difference in kind of profile you'd expect if you were going to use something that was completely soaked in sherry, but the wood was knackered, versus something that still had some life in it?
If you get a cask that's been a Solera cask for a long period of time, it's not, as Erik mentioned, and they don't want interaction from the oak. That's not what they're looking for. They're looking at basically a vessel to hold for their biological or oxidative aging. So these casks are fairly inert. So if you were to get a Solera cask and tried to fully mature in it, I don't think you'd get a lot of you're not going to get over time a lot of interaction from the oak. So it's not going to be a very good experiment.
Just go on to that. Talisk, I think it was either last year or 2 years ago, released a 40-year-old that was finished in ex-Solera casks from the Quo Vadis Amontillado Solera from Delgado Zaleta in San Luca, it was only finished. It was never like full maturation for 40 years in an ex-Solera cask. What I would say, I could be wrong here, but I would say most casks that you find from a Solera, basically they're more fragile than a seasoned cask. You've got to be careful with them because they tend to be a lot older than a seasoned cask, because obviously seasoned casks are young. And so, an ex-Solera cask, I think, would tend more to be used for finishing a whiskey as opposed to long-term maturation of a whiskey.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So if you were to finish in a Solera cask, I think the one thing you probably wouldn't say on your label is how long you finished for, because you're not going to get a lot apart from the influence of the sherry that's in the wood, that's in the cask. You're not going to get a lot, But when you use casks which are effectively been, to be honest, perfectly made for making whiskey, then you really see the difference of the oaks. The sherry, of course, as we said, the sherry and the oak. But the major driver over time, of course, when you're maturing, is the oak style. So when you see a whiskey that just says on it matured in sherry casks, you sort of, if you know it's a dark color, well, it's probably European oak. If it's lighter color, there's two things you might think. You might think, well, it's all refill European oak, or it's an American oak sherry cask. That's sort of how your thought process might go. And actually, they're hugely different. They are two very different experiences. These whiskies are very, very different in terms of, but they both get classed as sherry casks. So you can get more difference between those than you can, we all know that the workhorse of the industry is the refill bourbon barrel or the refill hogshead, which are American oak, and they produce fantastic, fantastic styles of whiskey. But actually, if you mature a sherry cask, an American oak sherry cask for the first time, and it's big and bold and takes out a lot of flavors, or maybe over 20 years, you then refill that cask and fill it for 5 years, you might actually put it up against a refill bourbon of the same age, and you'll be like, there's not that much difference. And because, a lot of that influence is gone in the first fill, and you're getting more of that sort of oak refill element, which you get. It's quite confusing, is what I would say. So the way I just sort of point it out is, if you've got, at this end of it, you've got PX maturation and Oloroso a little bit. PX is very rich, Oloroso a little bit on the inside of that. And you've got bourbon at this end, vanillas and citrus and all that sort of thing. An American oak sherry cask is somewhere in the middle, really, in terms, you get a bit of that and you get a bit of that. And that's how I like to describe it. And I think it's a really honest way of saying that you can get very different styles of, firstly, which sherry do you use? But even Oloroso, and most of the time when you see a whiskey and it says sherry casks, it's talking about Oloroso most of the time.
Two questions that have come in which kind of link together quite well. So Wim's asked, obviously with Glengoyne and Tamdhu, you're using a lot of Oloroso and PX, but are there any other types of sherry that you have experimented with? I know you say no with Tamdhu, but
we're not even using PX at Tamdhu.
No, but with Glengoyne you do, don't you?
We produce one whiskey in travel retail that we finish in a PX cask.
Yeah. So there's no other sherries being used at them two distilleries.
No, we have got port pipes and things. We have got things maturing. Yeah. But that will be more on a general release. A limited release. And Tamdhu at the moment, we're all very much aligned on what we're doing with Tamdhu. We're building the base of Tamdhu. We're showing off our quality sherry casks, and you see it now with people who talk about sherry cask. Tamdhu slowly sort of coming into the discussion, which is great. And I've just been hearing more and more, even from just anecdotal stuff from people in the industry, and Tamdhu's really good, and which is great. But so we don't want to start doing all these fancy things. We want to we've got three whiskeys. We've got three whiskeys. We showcase a lot of that by single casks, which we do, which have won best single casks in the world and fantastic awards, but they are wonderful. But we want to build an 18 next. And I mean, a great example, when we started the 15-year-old, we had a really big debate and actually we got to consensus as a company very quickly that the 15 could only be at 46%. It could not be at 43. It's got to be at 46. Makes it a better whiskey. So the next evolution for Tamdhu will be a Oloroso sherry cask, American, European, all combined together, 18 years. That's the next thing.
Yep.
So we're very much in the embryonic stage of Tamdhu, but it's a snowball going down a hill, and it's slowly picking up some.
So one of the questions that have kind of come through, and I think you can answer part of it, and Erik will answer part of it. Is there any difference in costs compared to Oloroso and PX when you're buying the casks? And is there any difference in cost in producing wines in general or sherries in general on, at the actual bodega side? Is there any difference in prices that way?
Well, I think the point is that ultimately, as the end user of these casks, we rent the sherry, for want of a better word.
Yeah.
We don't own the sherry. We specify the sherry. We do it through our partners. We'll say they know what we want. The cooperages know what we want, but they will work with their sherry partners, of course, and they buy in bulk and all these sorts of things. So, from a PX perspective, it'll be a different price to Oloroso at this age, Oloroso at that age, etc., etc. So yeah, there is a bit of variation. American oak sherry casks are a little bit cheaper because the oak is a little bit cheaper. But not much in it because it's still 6-year process. So actually, it's a bit like taxation, if you know what I mean. If the oak is half the price than a European oak, there's still all that cost of the 6 years lobbed on top of it. So actually, by the end of it, the difference is very little.
Yeah.
So
is there any? Sorry, go on.
No, that's so. Well, yeah, I mean, we don't use a lot of PX. We buy a lot of Oloroso, but it's Erik will be able to tell you more.
I was going to say,
I don't know the exact prices, but like just to give you an example, an Amontillado starts its life off as a Fino or Manzanilla, so it's going to be spending 2 to 3 years under floor as a biologically aged sherry, and then it's fortified, or if it's an old Fino, the floor will die naturally and it becomes an Amontillado. So obviously, if you want to season a cask with Amontillado, you're going to have a wine that's going to take a lot longer to produce, to put into the cask, whereas an Oloroso basically straight away it's fortified to 70%, goes into the cask, starts oxidative aging, and you can use it a lot quicker than an Amontillado. Pelicattado sort of starts its life off as a Fino or a Manzanilla, and then tends towards becoming an Oloroso. PX is a very expensive production. Basically, PX grapes are put out in the sun when they're harvested. They basically, here we go.
They're like raisins, are they not really?
Yeah, they're like raisins. So basically the sugars are concentrated.
Right,
so, yes.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, so I mean, there's obviously, there's a, like whiskey, there's a time in terms of the preparation of them, but I don't know the exact cost of the sherry, but we never own the sherry. It's just a matter of it being where it's sort of leased rented to us for a period of time.
We could get a rough idea of the different costs per litre. Someone has asked a question about Celeras. I'm sorry, I'm going to go back to. I'm looking at the chat as well, Soren. Basically, the Celera system started in San Luca de Barrameda in about 1760. Then it moved to Jerez, but it's just not in the, as I said before, it's not just in the Sherry Triangle. You get it in Condado de Huelva, you get it in Malaga, you get it in Montilla and Moriles. Also Jura in France and Hungary. They also have Celera systems for wine.
Yeah.
So, and someone also asked a question, regarding, well, how do they replace a cask in a Celera system? Well, basically any cask that goes into a Celera system would need to be seasoned for a minimum of 10 years before it even gets considered to be used in a Celera system.
So that's quite an age then, and if it's a 10-year-old before it goes in there, then that's something I didn't know especially. So
I didn't know that. I always wondered that. Learn something you see every day, Erik. Thank you.
So it's a 10-year, no matter what stage it goes in, it's got to be a minimum.
That's just what I've been told. Gordon will say, like, if you see a Celera system in Jerez, all the casks are painted black, and the reason they're painted black is to identify leaks. It's not just to make them look better and things. So they're painted black to identify leaks. So these, this is the thing where, a whiskey distillery is different. You can fill the cask with new make spirit, shove it in the warehouse, and forget about it for 10 years or longer. Whereas with sherry, the production of moving the wines from through the Criadera and Solera system is a very labor intensive, even with modern machinery. There's a lot of work goes into it. But these casks stay in one position. They're not moved around willy-nilly. That's why you have Soleras that are hundreds of years old. Just to give you an example, I'm going to show you this one here. This is from Bodegas Alvear in Montilla. Now, this is the second oldest winery in Spain, fourth oldest company in Spain, and the oldest one in Andalucía. This wine comes from a Solera that started in 1927. We've also drunk wines from the same company that was from Soleras, where the Solera started in 1830. Now, with a Solera system, technically, if you get a wine from a Solera that started in 1830, for instance, you're technically drinking a little tiny minute amount of a wine from 1830.
And one question that kind of came in as well was, is there any particular sherries or wines that really wouldn't suit themselves to whiskey maturation?
Well, our friend Rafa basically says you don't see a lot of Fino or Manzanilla sherry. And I know Aaron had a single cask Fino a few years back, which was actually quite nice. But biologically aged sherries, I think there's a problem with sulfur in the casks. My understanding. So they don't suit whiskey maturation. So
I mean,
far between.
We produced when I worked at Bowmore, there was a Fino 40-something-year-old Bowmore, which was actually really good, but it had a real dryness to the end of it, and tropical fruitiness, because Bowmore's like that when it's old. But I mean, of course, if you're maturing initially in bourbon, then if you're going to finish, you need to finish in something that's going to drive a bit of change in the whiskey. And Fino's quite delicate. It's quite dry as well, and actually sometimes it may not deliver enough change in a whiskey, if you know what I mean, depending on what you're trying to achieve. So maybe that's when it works in much older whiskies, because there's the alcohol's more in the background. There's a tropical fruitiness which you can add something to. But I would agree. I mean, I'm not a sherry expert, but certainly Oloroso is pretty much the main one that's driven throughout the industry. Pedro Jimenez is probably the second, but it's way behind Oloroso. Just one question from Edward that I can answer. So you're saying that it's all about how the sherry changes the flavour of the oak, rather than the sherry flavours itself having much impact on the flavour of the whiskey. Correct. That is what I'm saying, and it's a big misconception that this whiskey is this colour because of the sherry.
That's fascinating. Thank you, Gordon.
It's not this colour it's that colour because of European oak, and I've just proven it, because the lighter one, the older lighter one, is American oak. So the sherry, of course, there is sherry in the oak. We know there's a little bit of sherry in the oak. So that's why you can finish in it, because you'll get a bit of that initially. But actually, when what we're looking for, and we've seen it with, 10, 15 years ago, they said in Scotch, you can't use virgin oak casks. You need to use a cask that's had something in it, whether it be bourbon or whatever. Now you see whiskies produced in virgin oak, American oak casks, charred for a minute, that would normally go to the bourbon industry, coming straight to Scotland. And I worked for Auchentoshan, who produced a cracking whiskey in a virgin oak cask. Spicy, big colours, big bold flavours. And that just shows you that it's oak that matures whiskey, not what was in it before. And so the sherry is crucial to preparing the oak for our perfect interaction and maturation. If we did a virgin oak, European oak sherry cask, so effectively charred it after 2 years of drying, charred it, or toasted it, for half an hour, brought that to Scotland, you'd get big colours quite quickly. You'd get big tannins. You'd get it, and it would be after 3 years, it'd be jaggy and all quite sort of spicy and all, and what actually works really well is, even when you do put the sherry in there, it does take an element of that out. But actually, when you combine European and American oak is naturally a little bit more jaggy on the taste. It's got that sort of tannic dryness. It's got that sort of further back in the palate, the spiciness. The American oak is a bit more rounded and it almost fills in a bit of the gaps, if you know what I mean. And for me, Glengoyne 18 is a perfect example of that.
Yeah. I mean, what I love the fact of, obviously, we've got you on sort of talking about Glengoyne and Tamdhu. We had Andy Watts on last week talking about Baines and the 3 ships from South Africa. And the one name that keeps coming up is Auchentoshan. And I just love that because it's one of my favourite distilleries as well. But what I was going to go back to is, so obviously if you're getting a sherry put in theory, how much, because I'm assuming you're getting them in full rather than broken down. So how much liquid do we think is still in one of those?
Not full of whiskey, yeah.
And you will get, you have to fill into an empty cask. So what they tend to do, now I know a certain writer banged on about this recently or a few years ago about, you know, candles and all this sort of stuff. Effectively, there is an element sometimes of a bit of transportation sherry, which is left in there. And then it will be emptied and it will be filled with the spirit. So, again, it's not an area I actually know that much about, but what I do know is when we drop the casks off the truck, and this is the relationship we have with our producers, is that we will smell them initially.
Yeah.
And if they are off, it goes back in the truck. We just don't accept it. So, but I mean, Erik, I'm not 100.
Yeah, well, again, looking at Ruben's article and speaking to Rafa, when they transport a cask, they'll leave maybe 5 to 10 litres of the sherry or the wine that's in the cask, just so the cask doesn't dry out. So basically be transported with a little bit of sherry or whatever wine is the cask has been seasoned, and just so, because obviously if you don't, the staves have a potential to dry out and actually the cask becomes
exactly right.
watertight.
Exactly right, and then we have to fill empty casks. So that's the rule of whiskey. So it will be emptied out of there. But no, there's no doubt that, you know, and the point is, if actually I was to, this is dark and wonderful and an average age of 10 years old. If I hadn't put the sherry in here, it'd probably be darker, maybe, or at least the same color. So, you know, but it'll be a very different whiskey. It would probably be too tannic, too oaky, too spicy, too. Now, I think where you see this a little bit is with older bourbons. Sometimes you get these older bourbons that are spicy, dry. They've probably been in a cask too long in the hot temperatures and up against that new char. But certainly from a sherry perspective, that sherry is ultimately, as we say in the movie that I've shared on the link, the sherry is there to modify the flavors in the oak. So there's no point in air drying and creating your cask and toasting it for the right amount of time and then seasoning it, and the sherry does all the work and the oak doesn't. Why would you bother doing all the bit beforehand? It's a journey that the oak goes on.
I think a good analogy for the sherry or whatever wine you used to see in there, it's like the salt and pepper for the wood.
Yeah. And what I will say, Gordon, I've copied, and for everybody else here, I've copied the link into the chat side on Twitter, and I'll also put the link out on public on Twitter as well later on. So you don't all have to rush off now and watch it. But one question which I think's quite an interesting one from Marcus is, what would you say are the best production conditions for whiskey to get the most out of an ex-sherry cask? And I think this will be an answer that changes from everybody that you talk to, depending where they're from as well, because obviously different countries are going to say different things.
Yeah, I mean, look, I tell you, a brand that has done very, very well with sherry casks is Cavalan. And they've brought some wonderful sherry casks out of very young age. But some of them are very spicy and very full on. And, you know, it's, if you like that kind of thing, fantastic. You know, a lot of them are sort of that sort of European oak punchy style, but they're maturing them very quickly. But then again, some of them for me are a little bit too much like that, but they produce some really good stuff. So they've got a really hot temperature maturation in Taiwan. I also, if you look at another great whiskey, which unfortunately is now ridiculously out of price point, but Yamazaki 18. You know, I worked for Suntory, and you know, their understanding of sherry casks, you know, we use the same suppliers. We're using the same suppliers they do. We use the same suppliers Macallan do. So, you know, they're using quality sherry casks as well, but they also use, for example, Mizunara and Japanese oak, but they won't use that from a sherry cask. That'll be sort of ex-whiskey or a virgin oak cask. So, you know, from a Scottish perspective, I think, you know, or from a British perspective in terms of making whiskey, I think it's all to do with that balance of how quickly you interact. So when you get a whiskey, the color comes very quickly in the first few years, and then, you know, we've got a great display at Glengoyne, if anybody's been to Glengoyne.
Yeah.
And I think it's actually a really good display, explains it really well. And you know, the color comes in you get more color change in the first 10 years from 0 to, say, than you would in the last 20. So, you know, the color comes really quickly, but you still need to build that depth of complexity that you get over time as well. And I think that's where Scotland does benefit from warehouses that are cold and maturation that is slow and angel share that is pretty low. But then again, different whiskies, I don't think there's a set style, but I think, you know, dunnage style warehouses for sherry casks, absolutely. Bang on, yeah, definitely.
Sorry, I've got a bit of a two-part question for you there, Gordon. You mentioned that sort of capacity is now sort of the big issue with the sherry cask. With the amount of sort of new distilleries opening in the UK and around the world, is it getting harder to get stuff, or are your sources pretty reliable? Is it just sort of driving up the price?
We are hedged into the future, so we've worked with these guys for years. So but we can't get probably as many as we want. But so that's why we're limited in the amount of whiskey that we can produce, particularly for Tamdhu. But
my second point just is, what's the Rosebank cask regime going to look like? Do you know?
One very not sherry. I'll explain in a minute. But look, I'm going to be very honest. There are people out there who are calling sherry casks that are not sherry casks in my book. There are people and I'm not going to name any names, but you know, there are people out there who are buying sherry out of supermarkets and putting it into casks and trying to call it a sherry cask. I mean, that's as mad as it's getting sometimes. So there is if you watch that film, and if you know, please do, because it's about Tamdhu, but it's not overtly about Tamdhu. It's about the process, and it's on YouTube as well. Spain to Speyside Tamdhu. Just type it in. The key thing is that there are sherry casks and there are sherry casks. There are bourbon casks and there are bourbon casks, and never the twain shall meet sometimes. So you know, we work on a process of this is how it is, this is how much it's going to cost. You know, the financial guys go, can we not cut the cost anyway? Can we not, you know, transport more? Can we not cut down the drying time, cut down the seasoning time? No, because it changes the way we make our whiskey. It doesn't make it look as good. So if we are a brand like Tamdhu, we take Tamdhu for an example, that is really saying we are sherry casks. There are other brands that do it. There are other brands that do great sherry casks or use sherry casks in great ways. Bowmore, my other favorite distillery, 15-year-old darkest, great whiskey. Glendronach. You know, other people have used great sherry casks, but you know, it's how you use them. And you know, I also say if you're going to try and hang your hat on sherry casks to be known for it, surely you've got to use natural color, haven't you?
Yeah.
If that's your story, and that's what we do, and we do that. So you know, that is the key point. Is that, you know, I'm not obsessed with natural color as long as it's a great tasting whiskey. Yeah, but I hate whiskies that are overtly not. They're gone too much. I mean, Bowmore used to use color, but only from a consistency perspective, and it was very obvious that the whiskies were just produce a lot more. I get it. There are other whiskies that do it a different way.
Just to add what Gordon said, sorry, Soren. Basically, the Consejo Regulador of Jerez, the Sherry Regulatory Council, have actually brought in a certification for cooperages that so you actually have to pay to get cask certified as sherry cask to use that name. And I can see a time in the future where maybe Brexit's going to change that, but sherry cask on a label might be forbidden unless it actually is a proper sherry cask.
I think it should be. I think it should
be. You know, to be honest, you know, from my experience since we looked into this in 2014, to me it's more important what is the kind of sherry that's in the cask should be on the label. If it's more than one sherry cask, more and more people they want to know about the provenance of things these days, and they want to know more about what they're drinking. And I think some producers need to be a bit more transparent with what they're putting in a bottle.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with that. I mean, from a bit of a geeky perspective, I'd like to see the oak type as well, because that really drives a difference in flavour. But to 95% of whiskey bars, it's not really relevant. So
that's it. I mean, sort of a question. Well, it's a double-barreled question, and she did ask it a little bit earlier, but I've been trying to leave it a little bit before I came. But the first part, sort of going to Erik. What effect, if any, does the floor yeast have on the impact of the barrels? And then coming back to Gordon, what is the sherry accreditation Glengoyne have? How do you get it, and what is it? So if we go to Erik first about the floor yeast.
Right. Basically, as we've explained in Gordon, it says the Solera system. These casks are very, the wood does nothing. So basically, the yeast doesn't affect the actual wood. It basically only affects the wine as it's aging. It doesn't. We said about that's why there's very few Fino or Manzanilla aged whiskies, because the fact that basically these casks aren't readily available anyway, and it's not something you would season the cask with, because Manzanillas and Finos are very light in style.
Yeah, Oloroso is used for a reason, because it imparts, it's very good at seasoning, actually, in terms of taking elements out the oak. And of course, we know it, if you've got a hint of sherry, if sherry cask will impart a hint of its flavors into a whiskey, but over time they will diminish, and it will be the oak that's more prevalent, of course. And so that's why the Scotch whiskey industry is very, very strong on, and I think a producer was I think Glenmorangie were pulled up on this relatively recently. I think Glenmorangie produced a whiskey that was from a cider cask. And they got pulled up by the SWA because they were insinuating that it was the cider that was giving the influence in the whiskey, which is not. That's not the answer. That's not what. It's, ultimately it's the oak, and that's the thing everybody must always remember. So yeah, I mean, I'm certainly from our sherry accreditation perspective, again, it's all dealt with by our partners in Jerez, but the fact that we're dealing with bodegas within that sherry triangle, which Erik pointed out earlier, means that it is officially approved sherry. It will come and be, it will be approved to be used as seasoning sherry, and so we can legally call it sherry on our bottle. And we can talk about it in the way that we can do. But of course, there's other regions that produce stuff that's very similar, but it's not from the sherry triangle that we were talking about. So everything we do is officially approved Oloroso sherry.
Yeah. I mean, one person, which I think sort of mirrors everybody's thought, would love to be locked in a warehouse with some maturing sherry casks of whiskey as well, and chuck away the key. I think we'd all like that one. But one question Ed has sort of asked again, and this could be an interesting one, because I know I have my thoughts, but probably aimed more at Gordon. There's been a discussion recently on whether casks take on the flavour through the atmosphere, such as Islay whiskies, and taking on the maritime notes. Now, my theory to that is you can have some Islay whiskies that are matured on the mainland, and people still swear that they get the maritime flavour. So,
can I come in on this? Sorry. Yes, you go first. Can I come in on this first? Because a lot of people, there's this romantic notion. Salt isn't a volatile substance. So basically, I learned on the Sherry Educators course, people swear that because San Luca de Barrameda is it's on a coastal estuary, that when you drink a Manzanilla, the salinity comes because it's the ocean breezes coming from the Atlantic, and they go through the bodegas and they go into the cask. It's bollocks. It's a romantic. Salt is not a volatile substance. The number one vaults at Bowmore, yes, they're below ground, but I honestly believe salt isn't a volatile substance. The president of the Consecu's basically said you can't get salt through wood.
Yeah.
No. Look, I mean, like, firstly, as I was head of education for Bowmore for a while, I'll tell you a funny story. I was I was sort of doing a tour around the internet, and I was I found this guy from a store in Australia called Dan Murphy's. It's big stores around Australia. And he was doing a tasting on Bowmore 12-year-old. And I was like, oh, this will be interesting. Fair enough. Started off brilliantly. Everything you wanted to hear. Perfect. And then it all went wrong. And he goes, and it's a beautifully salty whiskey, this, because they open up the doors of the warehouse, and I'm like, and then they roll the casks in the sea, and it gets a sea salt crust on it. And I'm sitting there going, and I'm on the phone to our Australian distributor going, what is going on? And I'm like, and I think it's, God, it's utterly hilarious. And it just shows you the importance of education and consistency. I agree with Erik to a certain extent. The only thing that I would say, and this is a really nice analogy, is if you were to, let's buy two of the most famous Italian cars, an Alfa Romeo, right? And if I was to park an Alfa Romeo at Glengoyne for 10 years, and I was to park an Alfa Romeo on the front of Bowmore for 10 years, after 10 years, they'd be very, very different in terms of, one would be a rust bucket and the other one would probably be full of moss and greenness and whatever. Now, the only thing, there's still a lot we don't understand, but I totally generally agree with Erik, is that, you know, when you're trying to produce a whiskey, you produce a whiskey that has these types of things in it due to a whole range of different reasons. But that's not always the case. So there's no consistency in it. It can just be certain casks. So that makes you think, okay, that's a bit of anomaly. But there's also that element of that, you know, if you stand in Islay, and, you know, there is a definite different style of air, of course there is. But I don't think it influences whiskey in any major extent.
Do you think it's a preconception, though, that because you see, say, for argument's sake, Bunnahabhain or Lafroig or whatever on a bottle, you assume it's been matured on Islay? Whereas, obviously, if it's matured on the mainland but made in Islay, people are still picking up that maritime flavours on it. So, is it just a preconception of a name?
I don't know. Maybe a little bit. There's no doubt. Look, Bowmore brought out a whiskey a couple of years ago that was called salty. It was a very salty style whiskey because they picked wine casks and other types of casks that sort of gave across that impression. You pick up salt at the side of your tongue. Yeah. But there's obviously elements when you drink a whiskey that gives you that similar style, which is what you're picking up. So it's not salt. Of course, it's not salt. No. But you know, it has that style. But then you speak to, you know, Pernod Ricard will tell you that I went to a tasting about a Pernod Ricard tasting, and I was tasting all these whiskies, and the guy was doing it. Now we're on to Scapa. Scapa is a whiskey from Highland, you know, from Orkney. Yeah. Got no maritime style to it at all. No. It's not maritime in any way. So, you know, I think there's like everything. If you want to embellish it, you'll try and embellish it. But, you know, I don't think it's I agree with Erik ultimately, but the analogy of the car is always just a good one to think about a little bit as well.
So basically, we've recorded for an hour and a half, and you've killed 2 romanticisms now.
Well, we can always put in more.
Yeah, brilliant. Yeah,
make up some more.
Yeah, are there any other romantic notions you'd like to dispel at this moment in time?
I mean, one thing that I kind of would add to that, and I always promise myself I'm not going to bring the word up, but it kind of also dispels the fact of the salt maybe being into the barley with the terroir and things like that, because obviously some Islay distilleries will bring the barley onto Islay to be, you know, malted and things like that. So it's not even the barley that could be bringing in the salt.
No, and I think if you think what the barley goes through as a process, it would never retain anything. You know, it goes through, it gets blitzed if you think about it with hot water.
No, I'm a firm believer in terroir. I think the whole concept is absolutely fantastic.
Yeah. No, I'm a great believer that out of the 3, you know, barley. Most distilleries look at barley as a you know, it's a tool to make whiskey, of course, and they measure it in terms of the, you know, the yield that you get, which should be 410 liters of pure alcohol per ton of barley, for example. And that, you know, for most for most people that is true. I think personally, you know, if you speak to people who use particular types of barley, firstly, yeah, it causes a lot more problems for them. Yields go down and things like that, of course. And so there's a whole range of different, you know, people are looking for a unique selling point, and I totally understand that. And using local barley and all that sort of thing, totally get it. And using particular strains of barley, we all know that Golden Promise years ago was always a revered strain of barley, and I get asked that more than ever. Is this a Golden Promise? I should have absolutely no idea. We finished using that 20 years ago. So, you know, but barley does have, you know, there's no doubt, if you actually sit and taste two new make spirits with different barleys, yeah, you can sometimes pick up a bit of a difference. There's no doubt you can. But if you you were then also to say, here's an 18-year-old from Glengoyne that was Golden Promise, here's an 18-year-old that wasn't Golden Promise, same cask, same maturation, same everything else, you're not going to sit there and go, oh, now that one's the one without Golden Promise. You never would do that.
I mean, one question that you may be able to answer on this one then, and I think I know the answer, but I'm going to ask it anyway. But if you take new make from different parts of the cut, is that going to taste different as well?
Yes, and we do that at Glengoyne.
Yeah, so if you take a bit of the new make from the early part of the cut and then a little bit, and you then do, say, another distillation and take it from halfway through, you are going to find a difference anyway. So it kind of almost makes it that you can show that there's a difference in a way, because it depends where you take the sample from.
That's getting quite in depth, but yeah, I mean, if your cut's from 74 to 60, say, roughly, and your new make 60, 69, say, roughly, if you were to do a filling from the bit from 74 to 70 and then reduce it to 63.5, you might get quite a bit of a different style, because it's a very different new make spirit, but it's not consistent, so that's why you would never do it. But certain distilleries have done it, and actually, you know, I know that going back to what I know that Bowmore obviously still malts its own barley. They use a different variety of barley on the floor than they do for the barley that they bring in. Every product they produce is 2/5 and 3/5, you know, 2/5 of this and 3/5 of the barley they brought in. But they've also matured, and they've also produced spirit that's 100% floor malted barley. And I don't know if you'll actually get to a point in the whiskey. It'll probably say it in the label. Bowmore floor malted 100%. I'm sure it will. Will it taste a lot of difference? I don't know. I have no idea. Don't know. I can't wait to try. But yeah, look, I mean, there's a huge there's a huge debate over a lot of things in whiskey, and everybody.
Yeah. It's quite. Sorry, Soren. It's quite interesting to see what Mark Rainier is doing over in Waterford in Ireland, with the different farmers, the different barleys, and that sort of thing. You know, to me, you know, it'd be interesting to see whether you can you taste the difference in a new make. You probably can from different barley strains and what have you. But at the end of the day, when 60 to 80% of the flavour from whiskey comes from the wood, I think it's the wood that's more important than the terroir. In my opinion.
You see, I mean, that's kind of one area I do disagree a little bit with you, Eric, because I don't know if it's as high as 60% in the sense of it, because the amount of differential that you can get in the process, does that not affect the overall end product? And how do we know? Because we don't really understand how the wood interacts with the whiskey anyway. Yeah, it's impossible kind of to say what is the process and what is the wood.
Yeah, look, I'm going to sit in both camps here. Yeah, why not? I agree that there is an element of influence of the ingredients in the making of whiskey.
There's got to be, yeah.
For me, water has the least.
Yeah.
And you know, I've been in Japan where they study this to the nth degree. The production obviously is important, and the idiosyncrasies of how that is produced is huge. The fermentation, we know, is what develops you into a style of particular style. So you start off with a correct grind, you start off with a clear wort, you start off with a longer fermentation, you're moving into fruity character. That's what's going on. Then you'll hear people talk about, stainless steel washbacks or Oregon pine washbacks. Makes absolutely no difference generally. It's down to how you clean them, pretty much.
Yeah.
The cleaning regime is the most important thing because it's all about bacteria, and you'll get more of that. But it's only in there for 60, 70, 80 hours. So you're not going to get influence from the oak, which I once heard somebody say that our Oregon pine washbacks are crucial to the flavor of our whiskey. And I don't think they are. But, you know, if you've used Oregon pine, you'll always use it. Then the distillation, as we know. So, I mean, you know, if you're using different barleys, then I would imagine that, you know, how that manifests itself is got to get your grind right each time, because it's, you know, it's not the same. I mean, if you go to Glengoyne, only Robbie can change the grind settings. And if you get your grind wrong, which you can do with barley that is less, what's the word? No, more sort of specialized.
Yeah.
It starts to create further problems down the line. And so, you know, for me, you know, this is what I love about whiskey. There's a huge debate about a whole range of different things, but you know, barley, you know, where I would really like to see Scotch whiskey actually do more is in yeasts.
Yeah.
I genuinely think yeasts are, most distilleries are using pretty standard yeasts. And if you, having represented bourbons, and, you know, I've worked for Jim Beam, I've worked for Maker's Mark, if you've ever been to Four Roses or you've drunk Four Roses, it's got 5 different yeasts, 10 different recipes, and it shows you how important the yeast is in making, you know, and so every bourbon distillery has its own yeast because they don't have the casks to make the difference.
Yeah.
They don't really have, you know, they generally have the same mash bills, about 70% corn, 15% malted barley, 15% rye. They may move that a little bit. And the temperatures of distillation are important, and the position in the warehouse. But actually the yeasts are really important for them because it drives the difference between this one and that one much more than it does in Scotland because of the other things that we use. So, you know, given the choice, if you said to me barley, yeast or water, I'd probably go for yeast.
Yeah. Yeah. I think a lot of people would agree. And I think the fact of when we're looking at the process, the amount of variation that you can put into the process of making the new make has got to affect it dramatically. Yeah.
No, absolutely. And, you know, if you think about it, what water, I mean, you get hard waters and soft waters, and we know that makes a big, you know, but in Scotland, waters are fairly similar. There's places that have harder waters, but, you know, what the water goes through, you're like, okay. And then you have obviously the other thing is, of course, yeast happens much further on in the process. So you've not, so you know, you've got that 60 hours or 50 hours or however long you do it for of yeast's impact to make that beer. So what goes into the still is really, really important. And so if the yeast is producing a really particular style of fruitiness because it's a particular yeast that you've cultivated over 25 years and it's Glengoyne style of yeast, or it's Macallan style of yeast or something, for me, that's a really big point. And I'd like to see Scotch, but we don't really need to because we've got this amazing way of creating flavors in maturation and distillation. So there's a lot of ways of looking at it, but, you know, yeast is one that, you know, I think, you know, having different yeasts would be really interesting and actually looking at them, but you're not going to see that for years.
No. Glengoyne and Tamdhu then, do you just use a standard distiller's yeast then?
Yeah, no, I can't remember. We actually do use a specific, right. We do use a yeast that actually we've worked with to get a fruitier style from it. You know, we use cream yeast at Glengoyne, and you know, we use Kerry and I can't remember the other style, but and we use a slightly different yeast at Tamdhu that does, but it's, you know, it's not a yeast we've cultivated. It's a yeast that's available. And it works very well with Tamdhu spirit because of our fermentation and obviously our Oregon pine washbacks, which have a huge influence on the style of the spirit. Not.
I mean, what I would like to try and do now, I'm just seeing a lot of thanks to Erik. I'm not sure if he's disappearing.
No, I'm not wanting to. I'm just saying I've really enjoyed this. I'm going to talk about yeast and sherry, the thing is, you know, the 3 sherry towns, Jerez de la Frontera, Alpuerta de Santa Maria, and San Luca de Barrameda, the yeast strains found in the bodegas in those towns are different, you know, and they're within 20 kilometers of each other. you go 100 kilometers north to Montilla's, and it's a different strain of yeast. And I'm sure this is something that obviously I agree with Gordon. You know, maybe yeast is something. I know, is it Angus that writes whiskysponge.com? He's a big one about bringing back old strains of yeast that were used back in the 50s and 60s into whiskey production.
I don't disagree.
It's a huge influence.
And while you're at it, direct firing as well.
Yes, yeah.
I mean, the perfect thing, Eric, you actually answered the question I was going to ask you if you was about to disappear. So, I mean, one thing I will sort of, while we are chatting to you, obviously, we kind of understand pretty much the process of making new make spirit. We know. What is the actual process of making a sherry then? If quite obviously in a compact sort of
right
thing.
And so right, the grapes will be harvested usually in August, September. There'll be 13% at the most. So they'll basically so what they'll do is they'll press the grapes, and they'll come up with, they'll have fermentation. Basically they'll have two the Musto-Yema, which is the top quality must, which gets fermented and used in Fino and Manzanilla, and the second must is basically used for Oloroso. And then they might have a third pressing in a pneumatic press, which will basically, there'll be all the pips and the stalks and everything. They'll use that for maybe making distilling into brandy. So they ferment the wine for anything up to 3 to 9 months, even a year. And what happens is they'll then, once the fermentation's finished and the wine's settled down, they'll fortify it. The Musto-Yema, or the first pressing, will be fortified to 15%, and it'll be put into the top Criadera in the Solera system.
Yeah.
So basically refresh the 2019 harvest wine will go into a Solera system this year.
Yeah.
And this year's harvest will go into the Solera system next year. And so basically,
so you're always a year behind in theory.
Yeah. So if you, I don't know if you can see the diagram. So basically, the Sobratabla is the wine from last year's harvest that will go into the top Criadera, and then that wine gets moved down when the wine's taken out of the Solera. Basically, it's a homogenization system. So some sherry bodegas will do 4 bottlings a year. Tio Pepe did their first one in March. Sometimes they'll do it in January. It depends on where the bodega is. And so basically that's the Finos and the Manzanillas. And those Finos and Manzanillas will become Amontillados. So those Finos and Manzanillas, with time, will be used to refresh their Amontillado Soleras, or they may even become Palicotados. Whereas the second, basically, the Oloroso is made from a lower quality juice, basically from the grapes, and that's the one that gets fortified straight to 17%. There's no yeast present, and it goes straight into oxidative aging. It's basically, the casks again are only 5-6 full, so there's gap, and basically again they'll go into the top of the Solera system and move the way down as the bottlings occur.
Yeah.
There's a really, really good diagram that explains how sherry sort of goes like that into different, the Solera system, but actually how from the, how different types develop. So there's one that shows you Oloroso and PX and, Fino and all that. So there is a diagram somewhere. If I find it, I'll share it.
I mean, one of the old romantic notions, which I'm sure you're going to knock on the head as well now, Eric, is you kind of have the visions of when they've gathered the grapes to go into a great big vat, and you see the people walking around with their bare feet squishing the grapes. I'm pretty sure that doesn't happen anymore. Then
it happens at the Harvest Festival. It's like it's an annual ritual, like the Harvest Festival. Yeah, they do it like they have a blessing of the grapes, and obviously very religious country, Spain, and they basically bless the first pressing of the grapes, and actually the pressings in Jerez, where they do it at the Harvest Festival, they actually put them in casks in the Consejo's headquarters. They've actually got casks filled with the juice from that first pressing. Well, basically they're turned into wines and put into the bodega.
I mean, one question Marcus again has asked, do we see much evaporation in the sherry production then over the years?
Yeah, it's the same as in, you know, you have an angel share in Jerez and elsewhere as well. You know, basically, you know, the wood's porous, and you know, I was reading today they will add alcohol to bring the alcohol levels up in some Soleras as well.
Yeah. I think you kind of already have answered this part. So the second part of Marcus's, you mentioned earlier the sherry producers are using historical yeast. Have they moved on from this, or is it a mix?
No. So this is actually a naturally occurring yeast that occurs in each sherry town and elsewhere in Condado de Huelva and Montilla and Malaga and Moriles as well. It's something that occurs naturally.
Yeah. Has anybody got anything else they want to add to this?
Yeah, there must be a question. Surely.
I've got a question for you, Gordon. You mentioned about using cream yeast. Is that dried yeast that's just been mixed to make it a liquid, or is it more akin to fresh yeast?
No, there's basically 3 yeasts that are used, styles of yeast. You get liquid yeast, which is a liquid, funny enough. You get creamed yeast, which is refrigerated and is basically tipped into the the washback. And there's my mother on the phone. Probably. And you get the interesting one is you get dried yeast, which is effectively, I like to call it the pot noodle yeast. It's yeast that's dried, but you need to put in the wash at a higher temperature initially to activate it.
Yeah.
So we all know that if you have your wash too high in temperature, Mum, go away. If you have your wash too high in temperature, you'll kill your yeast. But actually, dried yeast, which I think Auchentoshan uses, you need to stick it in initially in at a slightly higher temperature to get that yeast going, and then you drop it back. Then you've just put in cooler wash. So that's the 3 styles. Now, I think it's, in terms of how you actually deliver it into your washback is how that works.
Yeah.
So Lefroy, for example, is liquid yeast. We use creamed yeast, and other people use dried yeast. But so you have to have a slightly different process depending on how you do it. But in terms of that's the main differences. But most of the styles of yeast, and I don't know how many yeasts there are. Some people use distiller's yeast. Some people use other types of yeasts. But there's not this. I think it's an area that I think Scotch could work on. In my view, or whiskey, other than bourbons do it because they sort of have to do it because they don't have the diversity of casks they can play with. So they want to define their difference. We don't have to do it, but I think we should look at doing it more. Would be my sort of view.
Yeah, completely agree. I mean, we went to Loch Lomond and they were experimenting with an ex-Chardonnay yeast. And we tried the new make, and it was just completely different.
Look,
not so much weird. One of us was driving.
Yeah, we're looking at it too. We're always looking at doing something. So of course we're looking at it, but I think a lot, it's something that consistency is important, and you've got to change something for the right reasons. If you're going to change it completely, you may do limited editions, but. I think Glenmorangie came out with one relatively recently that was a yeast from the local area or something. I can't really, Alta or something like that. I heard the whiskey wasn't really that great, but I mean, it's a nice story, but that's just a personal, it's got to be done for the right reasons.
Yeah, I mean, the amazing thing is one of our members, Christoph, has been drinking quite a bit, and he's actually discovered time travel and gone back to being a young child. So I don't know if...
I see that. I did see that, yeah.
So Christoph's daughter possibly is now famous. I won't put it on too long because obviously we might get done for... Yeah, she's just seen herself.
Quick question about
that would be quite a good one if that had been Sophie drinking the shots and headed back in time. But I mean, sort of looking between you and Erik, is there anything sort of exciting within your own personal worlds of the whiskey and the sherry side that we need to be looking out for?
I mean, there's, I think, from our perspective, you know, we're getting through something at the moment, which I think is pretty much what the world is effectively trying to do. So, you know, a lot of our development has been put on hold. A lot of our capability has struggled a little bit down to, you know, for example, our bottling hall and things like that was closed for a while. Our distilleries, one of them was closed for a while, and our visitor centres are closed for a while. So I actually think it's a pretty quiet period in whiskey at the moment, if I'm honest. Certainly, you know, I've got to see a question about the Legacy series from my perspective. I mean, I thought it was a wonderful whiskey. The next one will be out this year, but it will be towards the end of the year. And the other thing that's exciting for us is, you know, which is on hold again at the moment, just down to COVID, is the regeneration of Rosebank, which we're very excited about. So there's quite a lot going on, but it's a bit like trudging through mud a bit at the moment, just with trying to get, even just shipping whiskey around the world is difficult with getting containers in the right place, and costs have gone up, and so there's an element of sort of trudging through treacle at the moment, but we're getting through it. But I think you'll see a lot more sort of a lot more interesting things happening in whiskey in the next, you know, once we're through this, I think.
Yeah. I mean, before we do kind of just head back to Erik, you've mentioned it a couple of times now, and I know the whiskey world is rather excited about the fact of bringing Rosebank back. Can you tell us much about where we're at, what the plans are, you know, how it all came about? I mean, sort of quite condensed, because I think we could talk about Rosebank for probably another 2 hours. So.
Well, I want to tell you just quickly about, going back to Leonard. Again, they'd arranged the deal with Diageo. Now, you know, nobody could have done really the deal. I mean, Ian McLeod's in a very unique position in the industry in terms of our history and who we work with. And so, you know, the deal was done with Diageo, and all the deals were put in place. And Leonard had a very good relationship with the top brass at Diageo. And they said to him, Leonard, would you mind just holding back on your press release until the 9th of October, 2017, I think it was? Leonard was like, yeah, no, that's fine. Yeah, we're not really, you know, And they said, we will tell you if you want to know why we'd like you to hold back. And he went, no, don't tell me, because I'll get drunk and tell somebody and it'll be a nightmare. So that's what Leonard said. So obviously what happened that week, on the Monday, the 9th of October, 2017, Diageo, poor Ellen, obviously coming back to life. So we were like, oh, right, we didn't know that. And Leonard, well, they said they would tell me, but I didn't want to know. So, so we just went on the Tuesday, and that was obviously, you know, the deal was in place. So where we are currently, we've knocked down the old distillery. We are on hold a bit at the moment, just with what's going on and social distancing and, you know, a whole range of different reasons at the moment. But we would hope to be up and running, you know, COVID. I mean, we were thinking this time probably in a year, but it's not going to be that now. I would think it's going to be early 2022 now, I would suspect. But yeah, I mean, the ultimate really interesting scenario about Rosebank is that we've only got very old stock, and we've got very limited amount of it. So, you know, it is, you know, single casks were hugely popular. They were, you know, and we're not going to have a whiskey until 10 years' time. So that's where we are with Rosebank. But it's an exciting project, and it's great to be involved in it. But there's a whiskey that had a very unique style, and that was down to, rather than a lot of the things we've spoken about, barley, yeast, water, that was down to its distillation and its condensers, triple distilled worm tub condensers. One of the main reasons why it had its style, much more than any of those other elements that we've just spoken about. So, you know, a wonderful whiskey, but always matured in sherry. Maybe refill sherry, maybe, but no first fill sherry. Always refill hogsheads, bourbon casks type thing.
So will we see the triple distillation and the worm tubs back again?
Yes, exactly the same size stills, exactly the same size worm tubs.
And how much stock were you able to buy with the distillery then?
Not much.
Not much, yeah. I mean, obviously we know there isn't a lot of it about, but you know, I mean, it's interesting to know the fact that you were actually able to buy some old stock along with.
Yeah, I mean, I think again, buy is a you know, there's a lot of other things going on as well. But yeah, no, acquire might be the best way to describe it. But yeah, no, but you know, the problem is everything is very old stock, and there's very limited amounts in the cask. I mean, there's casks with 25 bottles in them. So, you know, that, and actually what's brilliant is if, you know, I think, you know, the Diageo went, here's all the casks, boom, and they arrived, and we were like, there's none in that one, and there's none in that one, there's none in this one. So there was like 5 or 6, and they went, oh, well, we'll give you, we'll come to an arrangement, you know, and it's just the way the industry works. And so that's really, really good from that perspective. But yeah, look, we're not going to have a product that's in the reach of most people at a level that is going to be until we produce a 10-year-old or an 8-year-old in 10 years' time. So that, you know, but what is really interesting is that you're effectively creating a new distillery on the same site with the same sort of fundamentals. I actually generally think we can make it taste better. The knowledge that we have in the business, the consistency, I think it could be a really, really great whiskey. So, I mean, I just read a Dave Broom review of the single cask the other day, and he just said it was just sublime. So a very different style of whiskey.
And do you think once it's operational, so if we're talking maybe 6, 7, 8 years down the line, do you think that will affect the price of the old, as in bring it back down to earth a little bit more, or do you think that the old Rosebank will still actually rock it?
I don't know. I don't know where the second-hand whiskey market is going. I think it's been very influential for certain brands in the last few years, but I don't think it's as powerful as it was, which is maybe a good thing. I mean, we were very conscious of, you know, we've got a trade-off. We've got, you know, a cost of liquid. We've got a value that you put on that. There's a market that you're looking at. There's a particular style of consumer that you're looking for, and you know, these are the things that all go into that pot of how you produce a whiskey and what you're trying to do at that sort of higher level. And you know, there's a whole, you know, there's no doubt that was a premium priced whiskey. We know that, but would you open it and drink it? Maybe you and I wouldn't. Maybe some people would. So, you know, that's the challenge, and that's the sort of offset you do with when you only have very limited amounts of whiskey. So, you know, and if you've got, you know, it was, you know, if it had been, you know, we got a lot of people going, oh my God, that's really expensive. Of course we did. You know, absolutely, of course we did. If it was half the price, we would still have got that.
Yeah.
So there is that, you know, you know, and you know, people have their views and they're more entitled to say them. But you know, when you have a successful ballot and they all sell out, then you know what it's very hard to sort of, you know, sort of go, you know.
No, I mean, I love Rosebank for the simple, not for the fact of what it is, but it's a very similar style to the Auchentoshan. So it's a nice light sort of, obviously, like you say, the bourbon flavors. I mean, there's a couple of bottles down here that, you know, one's open, one's not. And I just love it. I just love the style. And that's why I was hoping you would bring it back to a very similar type style.
No, we will do it. Look, the style is everything at Rosebank. It's if there's a whiskey that is driven by its spirit style,
it's Rosebank.
It's Rosebank.
Yeah.
Obviously peated ones as well, but you know, for a non-peated whiskey that was renowned for its spirit style, Rosebank's pretty close to the top of the list. Yeah, if you're honest. So I think that's a really strong one. I mean, I think Auchentoshan's a great distillery too, and it's a, you know, it's you make spirits up at 81% alcohol, so it's a very different proposition to a peated whiskey at 67% alcohol.
I agree.
So I mean,
I think Erik's just kind of summed it up, talking about the old flora and fauna Rosebank. I mean, that was an absolute superb. But what I'm going to do now is just head back to Erik, because I'm conscious, obviously, we've spoke a little bit more probably about the whiskey side than the sherry. But
well, it is the Whisky Circus.
Yeah, but I mean, the idea is to obviously learn about a little bit of everything. But what I would like to sort of get from you now, Erik, is just a quick sort of breakdown of the different flavours and things we can expect from drinking, say, a PX or a sherry Oloroso or a Fino. And where do you see the sherry industry trying to get back to the heights it once used to be?
I don't know if you can.
Oh, there we
You
go.
can see the.
All right, yeah.
No, that's perfect.
Fino, Manzanilla, Amontillado, Oloroso, Cream, and PX. So I don't know if you can really see the colours.
Yeah, no, we can, yeah.
It's like the Glengoyne wall.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, I was just thinking that. Yeah.
Good analogy.
That's great.
And is that available to buy then, Erik?
No, I was. I
you can't do that to us.
Well, maybe we could do a competition to someone to win it at a later point in the year. It was something that was sent to me by the Conseco for International Sherry Week in November. I work in Blytheswood Square Hotel in Glasgow, and I did an event during International Sherry Week in November last year. And at the moment, I'm not working. It's strange being in the house, but things like this are passing the time. Flavors, right? Okay. Well, when you get a PX, now here's another one. This one is a single vintage PX from Bodegas Toro Albalar and Aguilar de la Frontera in Montilla-Moriles. This basically is a single vintage PX, and it's spent 26 years statically aging. And now most PXs will go through a Solera or a Solera system. They're pioneers of statically aged PXs. So I've got one. Yeah, I've got one. I managed to get one the other week. I've got a 1971 here, which was released in 1997.
That just happened to be my birth year as well.
Right. Okay. So PXs. Okay. You're talking. These are over 400 grams per liter of sugar. They're very, very sweet. But I say they're good for you because it's natural sugar. It's not processed sugar. So the other thing to remember as well, the PXs you find in the Sherry Triangle, just to give you an idea, basically in Montilla-Moriles is just under 5,000 hectares under vine. 95% of it is Pedro Jimenez, and 80% of that will go through the acileo process, turning it into raisins. And so basically 90% of PX production in Montilla-Moriles gets used to refresh the Soleras and the Sherry Triangle. So aged PXs like the one I've just shown you, figs, chocolate, cocoa, even tobacco. Those are the flavors you get from PXs. But as you go back to the drier styles, look, can you give me the Manzanilla out of the fridge? Yeah, sorry. So Finos and Manzanillas, basically, this one here, this is a Manzanilla and Rama from Bodegas Barbadillo in San Luca. And this is in Rama, which means raw. So it's basically one of the you were going to ask me about what's going to be happening in sherry. And one of the things, they were pioneers in the Sherry Triangle of in Rama sherries, which basically means raw. They're not as filtered as you would say a Tio Pepe or an Fino from Lustau. So basically, with biologically aged wines like Manzanillas and Finos, you tend to get yeasty notes, almonds, a wee bit of grass, some floral notes on the nose. You get salinity on the palate for sure. This is why people say, oh, it must be the coastal air in San Luca that gives the salinity, but you get salinity in Finos from Montilla-Moriles 100 miles away from the Sherry Triangle. Amontillado depends. The thing with the Amontillado is it depends on how long they've spent biologically aging and how long they've spent oxidatively aging. Some Amontillados you will still get characteristics of the Manzanilla and the Fino, but the Amontillados tend to be more toffee-like, nutty. The thing about these, I must say, these wines are best enjoyed with food. To me, Gordon will probably agree from when he visited Jerez, is you try these wines in a Tabanco in Jerez with even a simple thing like anchovies and vinegar or olives or salted almonds, they enhance each other. It's they are basically, for someone that's new to wines, when I do training in the hotel, I don't do these wines without having food to enjoy with them. It's just, obviously the PX is extremely sweet. I've had staff, and even though the Scottish palate, people like sweet things like deep fried Mars bars. If you have, one of my favorite food combinations is like blue Stilton and Pedro Jimenez, or or PX drizzled on, raisins.
Raisins, Christmas.
Yeah, so the PXs is raisins and Christmas cakes in a glass. Olorosos can be like that as well.
Nutty.
It's a nuttiness. The other thing with Olorosos, you've got to remember, they're going to be 18% ABV. One of the ones we sell at the hotel is 22% ABV. They're extremely strong wines as well, and they're not for the novice. As I said, enjoy them with food.
I always call a PX as my chocolate pot sort of thing. And what I mean by that is, when you go to a restaurant and you go, have we chocolate pot, and the thing arrives and it's tiny, and you're like, oh my God. And then you eat it and you go, that was just enough.
I mean, that's one thing. Like that. Yeah, that's one thing I think with the PX, that you don't need very much to have an evening with it. And I mean, this may sort of cringe people, that especially like somebody like Erik, but I love PX on ice cream. I think it just mixes perfect. And I mean, the company I work for, the English whiskey company, we do a PX with our whiskey, and that is beautiful over ice cream. You get a really proper vanilla ice cream, and it just really just melts into it perfectly.
No, it's lovely. Yeah, even Oloroso and ice cream is good as well.
Yeah. I mean, I find with the Olorosos, and you might be able to kind of explain why this is, they're very drying, and what brings that dryiness to it?
Well, the thing is, they're high in alcohol, which doesn't, which helps. But the thing is, basically, Fino, Manzanilla, Oloroso, Palocartados, and Amontillado are dry wines. Basically, they're not sweet in any way. The people, when they this misconception that sherry is something that your grandma brought out of her cupboard at Christmas every year. Croft Original and Bristol Cream, they only became popular in the 1960s and 1970s. It's just one of those. The misconception is that sherry is sweet, but it's only two styles that are sweet. Or you've got cream sherries. Now, cream sherries are often maligned in terms of the fact that you've got Bristol Cream and Croft Original. Now, Croft Original is a pale cream. I think Bristol Cream is a medium cream. And it depends on how much, basically the sugar level. So a good Oloroso wine that's got maybe 10 to 20% PX added to it and gone back into a Solera system can be a fantastic wine by itself. Harvey's also have one. They do one called Harvey's Signature Cream. It's a 12-year-old, so it's been through a Solera system for 12 years. The cream sherries are really, really good. Well, good cream sherries like are great with chicken liver parfait or foie gras if you're into that sort of thing. Salted almonds go with Olorosos, Amontillados, Palocartados. It's, to me, everyone tastes things differently and smells things differently. What I smell is different to what Laura smells, my wife. Women can smell more aromas and they can taste more than men. And when we do our tasting notes on our website, we tend to use Laura's notes because she can smell more.
I'm just going to say hello.
Hello.
Hi, Laura. Nice to see you.
Hi. It's to me, sherry and the wines from Montilla-Moriles, and even Malaga's even an amazing region in Condado. Well, there's some of the most amazing wine and the work that goes into making them. We've been lucky to see the process from the pruning of the vines in January. Fertilizer being spread on organic vineyards. We've seen bottling. We've seen the harvest. It's an amazing place to visit, and even going out of season is probably recommended. Like, you've got to remember the temperatures in Andalusia get through. You can easily hit 45 degrees. We've been in Seville and it's been 45 degrees in August. You know,
Yeah.
in September it could be over 40.
We went in late June and it was 38. I mean, it was roasting. And, you know, you're just like, as a ginger Scotsman, I was like, this is not ideal. But yeah, no, I mean, look, if you ever get the chance to go to that part of the world, from a sherry-loving whiskey perspective, it's an amazing place to go to.
Yeah, the other analogy, you know, I've used, I've been like, I don't know if Gordon will agree. Like, a lot of these bodegas are family-owned that we visit, you know, and it's a bit like some of the, you know, the whiskey distilleries, they're family-owned, and it's in a way, it's like, you know, you go to Glengoyne and you drink a whiskey at Glengoyne, and to me, it tastes better when you're drinking it at Glengoyne than it does in the house. Yeah. It's a psychological thing to enjoying it. You know, I've been in the number one vaults in Bowmore and had a whiskey straight from the cask. You know, there's experiences like that are the same when you go to a bodega. You know, Gordon was talking earlier about when he was at Williams and Humbert. These, you know, to actually try different wines. You can even, like, there's a terroir in the bodega. You can have casks 10 meters away from each other that were filled at the same time, or the Solera was started at the same time, and basically they taste completely different.
Yeah. So when you're putting an expression together, you obviously got a row of Solera casks at the bottom. Yep. So I take it that it's always kind of vatted together from the bottom one as well.
Yes, so it's a homogenization. They call it a homogenization of the cask. So they'll take the same amount from each cask and they'll mix it all together before they'll filter it and everything and then bottle it.
And how long before bottling? You know, how long do you leave it to marry before you actually bottle it?
That's up to the winemaker. I'm not sure. It depends. But to give you an example, Tio Pepe do an Inrama series every year. Now, Tio Pepe, there's 30,000 casks in the Solera that makes Tio Pepe.
Bloody hell.
Really?
Yes.
30,000 of the bottom row.
Yeah. So
bottom row Solera.
It's the biggest selling sherry in the world, and basically the winemaker Antonio Flores that makes Tio Pepe, he actually was born in a room above a bodega in the Gonzales Beers.
Oh, that's
it's stories like that. You know, you have the same sort of stories in whiskey. You know. Yeah. Gordon was talking about his colleague that retired earlier this year, 43 years in the distillery. It's the same thing in Jerez and the rest of the sherry triangle. So the Tio Pepe and Rama, you know, that was selected from 67 casks out of 30,000.
Yeah. I mean, what I'll do now is, because I'm going to bring the recording to an end in a minute, but obviously we'll invite everybody to stay for the after party, as we call it. But what would, you know, on a closing note then, what would you say the beauty of sherry is to you?
Eric.
I think to me, sorry, was that for Gordon first?
No, for you, yeah. No, sorry, this is just for you, yeah.
Well, you know, I'll include the wine. We basically, I call it the traditional wines of Andalusia.
Yeah.
It's been made the same way for for centuries. To me, there's a style of sherry for everyone. You know, some people think, well, sherry is going to be sweet. It's not. You get dry. Some people don't like dry. Some people like sweet. To me, it's the best wine for pairing with food. End of story. There's nothing better than being on the seafront in San Luca de Barrameda and getting a fresh boccherones fritters, is basically anchovies fried with a cool glass of Manzanilla. You know, you can't beat it.
I've done it. It's amazing.
Yeah.
I have done it. It's amazing.
Lovely thought.
Yeah. I mean, what I'll say to that, Eric, is, you know, I mean, and looking through the comments, I think a lot of people will agree that we have learned a lot today about sherry that I didn't know anything about. And I just think that, you know, that understanding of the sherry side and how the whiskey industry uses that, it's fantastic. So I would like to say, before we go on to Gordon for the last bit, thank you for coming in. And
no, thanks for having me. No, cheers.
Yeah.
No, thanks.
Thank you, Eric.
No,
full round of applause for Eric.
Can I just cut in and say?
and Laura, sorry, yeah.
I've been in the background doing all the props.
We've noticed you've been doing the hard work.
Your effort is much appreciated.
Yeah. No, thanks everyone. And honestly, you know, I've mentioned in the chat, I'm very happy to open doors if we can. Me and Laura, we're going to you know, all being well, we're hoping to go to Andalusia for 10 nights in January and visit both Montilla-Moriles and Sherry. And if anyone wants to meet up when we're there, you know, we're quite happy to join up with you. Or visit our website, send us an email. You know, I'll put our email address on. We're quite happy to give you recommendations, pass you contact details.
Awesome.
So what we'll do now is we'll just nip over to Gordon for the last words. You know, I mean, what is it about whiskey that excites you so much?
Interesting question. I mean, I'm a fan of whiskey, period, wherever it's from. So I love bourbon. I love Irish, one or two Irish whiskies. So no, I think it's I love the industry. I love the people in the industry. I love the product. And I also love things like exactly what we've been talking about for 2.5 hours. Is, you know, without the sherry industry and the history, and, you know, we may never have had sherry casks. You know, sherry casks would not have been, apart from those transportation casks, we would not have had sherry casks and whiskies the way they are. So I'm excited by the development of whiskey worldwide and the different styles, and the new distilleries everywhere is great. And I just hope I'm a little concerned in the next 5 years that there will be a bit more consolidation and it's going to be a tough 5 years, I think. But the growth is exciting, and the more people that are involved in drinking whiskey, talking about whiskey is a great thing, whether that's Scotch, English, French, American, Australian, North Korean. I mean, there really is no, you know, bounds to it. So I just love it as an industry, and, you know, working in it is a great industry to work in.
Yeah, no, thank you. And again, same to you, Gordon. It's been really good talking to you. I'm already a big fan of Glengoyne. Getting more to know the Tamdhu brands, and you know, it's thanks to people like you coming on and talking to us that gives us that interest to then go and explore these brands even more. And I'm sure everybody will agree today that today has been, it just keeps getting more informative. You know, we've had some great guests on, and every time we get another guest on, it just seems to get better and better and better. Yeah,
no, and I mean, I'm learning DIY tips from Christophe as well. So, and that is fantastic. Can you send me the video so that I'll have built by next week? I'll show you my shed that I've built.
I mean, unfortunately, the problem is we won't see Christophe because it's all on speaker view until now, where we can see Christophe. But he's obviously stopped drinking because he's aged again.
He's lost all his hair again.
Is that a Bosch?
What you don't realise, Gordon, is Christophe is actually he's building our circus tent.
Ah, right, okay.
You know, obviously, we're expecting to come into winter soon, so we need somewhere a bit more watertight.
Absolutely brilliant.
Again, you know, I'd just like to say thank you very much for coming on. I'm going to stop the recording now, so